Concrete dust tastes like copper. When a 240-pound man decides you're a joke, the air in the room changes. It gets heavy, sticky. This wasn't a Hollywood set. It was a cinder block cage, smelling of bleach and stale adrenaline, and all the cameras were turned off. Fluorescent bulbs hummed above the correctional facility's gymnasium floor, casting a sickly, jaundiced glare over the cracked linoleum. Charlie stood near a rack of rusted free weights, adjusting the cuffs of his simple cotton shirt. He was tired. A dull ache throbbed at the base of his skull, the kind of headache born from endless studio meetings, flashing cameras, and men in suits asking him to scream louder on film. He had come to this penitentiary as a favor to a friend, a martial arts instructor trying to start a rehabilitation program for inmates. Charlie was supposed to observe, give a few pointers, and leave. Keep it low profile, no press, just a quiet Tuesday afternoon in a concrete box an hour outside the city. The air in the room was suffocating. It smelled of cheap industrial floor wax, old sweat, and damp cotton. 6 guards stood near the reinforced double doors. They leaned against the painted cinder blocks with their arms crossed, chewing gum or picking at their cuticles. To them, Charlie wasn't a master. He was a television novelty. A small, wiry Chinese guy who made funny noises on screen and kicked stuntmen who were paid to fall down. Charlie felt their eyes on him. He always felt it. The quiet, simmering disbelief of large men who equated mass with violence. Then came the heavy rhythm of boots on the floor. Donovan Hatcher walked out of the locker room area like a man navigating a dense jungle. He was 6'3", built like a brick wall that had been repeatedly hit with a sledgehammer. Thick slabs of muscle pushed against his gray institutional t-shirt. His nose had been broken so many times it looked like a crushed walnut, and his skin was a patchwork of crude blue-black prison tattoos. Hatcher was the yard's undisputed heavyweight, a former amateur boxer who had traded the ring for armed robbery and aggravated assault. Hatcher didn't look at Charlie. He walked straight to the heavy bag hanging in the corner, taped his wrists with agonizing slowness, and began to hit the leather. Thud, thud, crack. The chains holding the bag rattled violently against the ceiling beams. Hatcher was hitting with the kind of ugly, unrefined power that didn't need technique to shatter a jaw. He was planting his flat feet and throwing his entire 240-pound frame behind his knuckles. Charlie watched him quietly. He noticed the slight drag in Hatcher's left foot, a bad knee. He noticed the way Hatcher dropped his right hand for a fraction of a second before throwing a hook. Careless, arrogant. "Good power," Charlie said, his voice calm, cutting through the hollow echoes of the gym. Hatcher stopped. The heavy bag swung back and forth, squeaking on its rusted swivel. The big man turned slowly, his chest heaving, sweat gleaming in the harsh fluorescent light. He looked down at Charlie, his eyes entirely dead. There was no movie star reverence here, just the cold, reptilian gaze of a predator looking at a smaller animal. "What do you know about power, Hollywood?" Hatcher's voice was gravel and phlegm. Charlie offered a tight, polite smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "I know that if you keep dropping your shoulder on that hook, a fast fighter will step inside and fracture your orbital bone before you finish your swing." One of the guards by the door, a heavy-set man named Miller, let out a low snort of laughter. He didn't bother covering his mouth. Hatcher wiped his brow with the back of his taped wrist. He took 2 steps toward Charlie. The size difference was jarring. Charlie stood 5'7", hovering around 140 pounds. Hatcher looked like he could eclipse him entirely. "Fast fighters," Hatcher mocked, his lip curling. He looked Charlie up and down, taking in the neat slacks, the canvas slip-on shoes, the slight frame. "I've seen your movies, all that jumping around, high kicks, screaming like a gutted cat. It looks pretty for the cameras, sure." Hatcher spat on the linoleum. The spit landed inches from Charlie's shoe. "But in here, in a phone booth, where nobody yells, 'Cut'?" Hatcher leaned in, his breath smelling of stale coffee and chewing tobacco. "Kung Fu is for kids. It's gymnastics. You bring that dancing shit to a real fight and a grown man is gonna break your neck." Silence dropped over the room like an anvil. Charlie didn't move. His face remained perfectly smooth, an unreadable mask, but beneath the cotton of his shirt, his pulse ticked upward. A familiar dark heat coiled in his gut. It was the same heat he used to feel on the sweltering rooftops of Hong Kong when rival schools would challenge him on the concrete, wrapping their hands in coarse rope, fighting until someone couldn't stand. He spent years trying to cultivate a philosophical calm. He read Krishnamurti, he meditated, he preached the fluidity of water. But right now, in this damp, foul-smelling room, the philosophy tasted like ash. Charlie didn't feel like water. He felt a sudden, deeply petty urge to strip this giant of his pride, to humiliate him. It was an ugly, unheroic feeling, and Charlie leaned right into it. He slowly reached up and unbuttoned his cuffs. "A grown man?" Charlie repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He rolled his sleeves up past his forearms, exposing the dense whipcord muscle beneath his skin. "Show me." Miller stopped chewing his gum. Beside him, Officer Carmichael instinctively rested a hand on his wooden baton. None of the 6 guards moved to intervene. They simply shifted their weight, their eyes wide, forming a loose, silent perimeter around the center of the gym. They had locked the double doors from the inside. Nobody was coming in. Hatcher laughed. It was a wet, barking sound. "You're kidding me, right? Little man, I will fold you in half. I don't want your lawyers coming down here when you need your jaw wired shut." "No lawyers," Charlie said. He kicked off his canvas shoes, leaving them neatly side by side. He stood in his white socks on the cracked, scuffed floor. The cold of the linoleum seeped into his soles. "Just you and me. No cameras, no cuts. Let's see what a grown man does." Hatcher's amusement vanished. The dead reptilian look returned. He cracked his neck, the tendons popping audibly in the quiet room. "Your funeral, Hollywood." Charlie stepped to the center of the floor. He didn't assume a wide, cinematic stance. He didn't let out his signature, high-pitched ki. He just stood there, his knees slightly bent, his right side forward in his modified Jeet Kune Do stance. His lead hand rested low, relaxed, almost lazy. His rear hand hovered near his chin. He looked entirely unimposing. Hatcher stepped up to meet him. The inmate dropped into a traditional heavy boxing crouch. He kept his chin tucked behind his massive left shoulder, his right hand glued to his cheek. He was heavy on his lead foot, intending to walk Charlie down, trap him, and crush him with sheer mass. The air felt thick enough to choke on. The rattling of the overhead vent sounded deafening. Charlie watched Hatcher's chest. He didn't look at the man's eyes. Eyes lie. The chest tells the truth of the lungs, the tension of the shoulders, the exact moment the brain sends the signal to kill. Breathe in. Breathe out. Hatcher moved first. It wasn't a slow, lumbering prison swing. It was a vicious, snapping left jab, surprisingly fast for a man his size, followed instantly by a devastating right cross aimed straight at the bridge of Charlie's nose. The punches carried the weight of a moving refrigerator. Charlie didn't block. Blocking was a mathematical error against someone nearly twice his weight. Instead, he slipped. He shifted his head a fraction of an inch to the outside. Hatcher's right cross tore through the empty space where Charlie's face had been a millisecond before. The wind off the inmate's knuckles literally fluttered the collar of Charlie's shirt. It was that close. Charlie felt the raw, terrifying displacement of air. He's not a joke, Charlie's mind registered instantly. He's a killer. Charlie pivoted on his heel, letting Hatcher's momentum carry the big man forward, and fired a blindingly fast back fist at Hatcher's temple. Smack. It sounded like a wet towel hitting concrete. Hatcher grunted, his head snapping to the side, but the big man didn't go down. Instead, he roared, absorbing the blow with a thick, calloused skull, and swung a massive left hook at Charlie's ribs. Charlie tried to angle away, but the linoleum was slick. His sock slid a quarter of an inch. It was a microscopic error, but in a fight, millimeters are miles. Hatcher's fist clipped Charlie's floating rib. Pain flared hot and white through Charlie's torso. It wasn't a clean hit, but the sheer blunt force of it knocked the breath from his lungs. Charlie stumbled backward, coughing, his bare feet scrambling for traction on the dusty floor. "Dance for me, Hollywood!" Hatcher spat, lunging forward, smelling blood. Charlie backpedaled, his eyes narrowing. The dull ache in his head was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp crystalline focus. The petty annoyance melted into cold survival instinct. The stinging in his ribs was a gift. It reminded him that he wasn't invincible. It reminded him of the grimy alleys of Kowloon. Hatcher rushed in, throwing a wild, looping overhand right. He was trying to trap Charlie against the rack of rusted free weights. Charlie stopped, retreating. He anchored his feet. He didn't try to punch Hatcher's head. Instead, as the giant lunged forward, exposing his lower half, Charlie launched a low, vicious sidekick straight into Hatcher's lead knee. He didn't aim for the thigh. He aimed directly at the joint, the fragile, complicated hinge of cartilage and bone. The impact was entirely uncinematic. It was a heavy, sickening crunch. Hatcher let out a ragged, breathless scream. His forward momentum collapsed as his left leg buckled inward. The massive right hand that was supposed to take Charlie's head off sailed wildly over Charlie's shoulder, crashing into the metal rack of weights with a deafening metallic clang. Charlie didn't pause. He didn't pose. Before Hatcher could recover his balance, Charlie stepped directly into the bigger man's airspace, completely violating the distance a boxer needs to operate. He trapped Hatcher's flailing left arm at the elbow, pinning it against the inmate's own chest. Charlie could smell the sour sweat on Hatcher's neck. He could hear the wheezing, panicked intake of breath from the giant's lungs. With his right hand, Charlie delivered a devastating upward palm strike squarely into the center of Hatcher's chest, the sternum. It wasn't a punch from the shoulder. It was a strike generated from the floor, twisting through Charlie's hips, spiraling up his spine, and exploding through his palm in a fraction of an inch. The sound it made was hollow, like striking a hollow drum. Hatcher's eyes rolled back. His entire 240-pound frame lifted onto its tiptoes for a fraction of a second, the breath violently expelled from his lungs in a wet hiss. Charlie pulled his hand back, watching the giant sway. The gym was dead silent. Even the guards had stopped breathing. Gravity is an unforgiving master. When a man's brain resets, shutting down the central nervous system to protect the heart from catastrophic trauma, the body forgets how to stand. It forgets tension, forgets pride. Hatcher did not fall like a stuntman. Stuntmen throw their hips, tuck their chins, and distribute their weight safely across the padded mats to ensure they can shoot another take after lunch. Hatcher fell like a slaughtered ox. His massive tattooed arms dropped limply to his sides. His heavy boots twisted awkwardly beneath him as his ruined left knee folded in a direction biology strictly forbade. The descent was horrifyingly fast. The 240-pound frame crashed onto the cracked linoleum with a sickening, wet thud that vibrated through the soles of Charlie's feet. Hatcher's skull bounced once against the floor, a hollow wooden sound, and then settled. A thin ribbon of saliva immediately pooled from the corner of his slack mouth, mixing with the dust and the cheap industrial wax. Charlie stood over him, perfectly still. The silence in the gymnasium was absolute. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed their jaundiced electrical drone. The sound suddenly magnified 100-fold in the absence of Hatcher's roaring. The heavy bag in the corner still creaked on its rusted swivel. Squeak. Squeak. Charlie's chest rose and fell in shallow, measured rhythms. Outwardly, he was a statue of composure, the dragon, the master. But internally, an exhausting, toxic cocktail of adrenaline and regret washed over his nervous system. The heat in his stomach, the primal fire that had urged him to strike, rapidly evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. He slowly unclenched his right hand. The knuckles were throbbing, flushed with fresh blood beneath the taut skin. He had hit the breastbone hard, too hard. It was a strike meant for the brutal, unregulated rooftop fights of his youth in Hong Kong, not for a caged animal in an American penitentiary. A sharp, stabbing pain radiated from his lower left rib cage, demanding his attention. He didn't wince. He refused to give the room that satisfaction, but he felt the deep bruised ache where Hatcher's wild hook had clipped him. The giant was clumsy, predictable, and arrogant, but the sheer blunt force physics of his fist could not be entirely negated by technique. Charlie knew that tomorrow his torso would be painted in ugly shades of violet and yellow. He would have to hide it from the producers. The myth of Charlie Lee did not bleed. The myth did not bruise. He stared down at the unconscious man. Hatcher's chest hitched violently as his body struggled to restart its natural rhythm. Charlie felt a sudden heavy wave of disgust, not toward Hatcher, but toward himself. He had spent the last decade building a philosophy of martial arts rooted in self-knowledge, in shedding the ego, in fighting without fighting. He wrote essays on the fluidity of water, on the emptiness of the vessel. He spoke passionately about transcending the petty, chest-thumping violence of traditional dojos. And yet, here he was, standing over a broken convict in a dirty cinder-block room because a bully had insulted his movies. Where was the water now? Where was the enlightened teacher? He had let a taunt penetrate his armor. He had allowed the ghost of the street kid from Kowloon to hijack the philosopher, using profound, highly disciplined biomechanics to essentially win a bar fight. It was a failure of character, masked brilliantly by a triumph of physics. Charlie looked up, his dark eyes cutting through the stale air to the perimeter of the room. The 6 guards were frozen. They looked like statues molded from cheap, sweaty clay. Officer Miller, the one who had laughed earlier, stood with his mouth slightly ajar, his gum visibly resting on his tongue. The baton that Carmichael had instinctively reached for remained undrawn, his hand paralyzed over the leather grip. They were large men, accustomed to managing violence through intimidation, numbers, and batons. They understood the mathematics of mass. In their world, the bigger man absorbed the blows and eventually crushed the smaller man. It was an undeniable law of the yard, but what they had just witnessed defied their geometry. It was a terrifying, violent magic trick. They had seen a 140-pound man wearing slacks and white socks dismantle their apex predator in a span of 3 seconds. There was no cheering. There was no slow clap. There was only the thick, suffocating dread of men realizing they did not understand the rules of the world as well as they thought they did. Charlie felt their fear. It was palpable, smelling of sour sweat and stale coffee. It was the same fear he saw in the eyes of studio executives when he demanded creative control, the same fear that kept him marginalized as a sidekick in American television. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of an outsider who refused to submit to the established hierarchy. He didn't want their fear. He wanted to teach. He wanted to share the beauty of expressing the human body to its absolute limits. But in this room, stained with bleach and violence, there was no room for beauty. There was only dominance. Charlie slowly lowered his gaze back to Hatcher. The big man groaned, a low, wet animal sound scraping the back of his throat. The central nervous system was rebooting. The pain was about to register. Charlie bent down, his movements deliberate, hiding the sharp pinch in his ribs. He picked up his canvas slip-on shoes. He didn't put them on yet. He simply held them in his left hand, leaving his right hand free, just in case. He walked backward toward the heavy double doors, his eyes never leaving the center of the room. He walked smoothly, his weight shifting effortlessly from the ball of his foot to his heel. The master was back in control. The ego was locked away, buried under a flawless mask of stoicism. But the concrete dust still tasted like copper in his mouth, a bitter reminder of the violence he carried in his bones, a violence he could tame but never truly erase. Hatcher's thick fingers twitched against the linoleum. His eyelids fluttered, revealing the rolled-back whites of his eyes before his pupils snapped violently back into focus. He gasped, a sudden, desperate intake of air that sounded like a drowning man breaking the surface of the water. He tried to push himself up, planting his massive right palm against the floor. But the moment he shifted his weight, his ruined left knee screamed. A sharp, guttural yelp tore through his throat, echoing terribly off the cinder-block walls. He collapsed back onto his side, curling into the fetal position, clutching at his leg, his chest heaving as he fought for oxygen that his bruised sternum refused to process. There was no movie dialogue here. Charlie did not offer a profound proverb about the consequences of arrogance. He did not extend a hand to help his fallen adversary up, proving his moral superiority. This was reality, and reality was ugly, awkward, and profoundly silent. Hatcher was just a broken man on a dirty floor, nursing injuries that would likely plague him for the rest of his life, locked in a cage where weakness was a death sentence. Charlie felt a pang of grim sympathy, quickly suppressed. Out here, pity was just another form of condescension. He reached the heavy reinforced doors. The 6 guards parted silently, creating a wide, cautious berth. They didn't look him in the eye. They looked at his hands. They looked at his chest. They looked anywhere but at his face. Officer Carmichael, his hand finally dropping away from his baton, fumbled blindly for the heavy ring of brass keys clipped to his belt. His hands were shaking. The metal keys clinked against each other, a bright, chaotic sound that seemed entirely too loud in the aftermath of the violence. He found the right key, jammed it into the heavy iron lock, and turned it with a stiff clack. Charlie pushed the door open with his shoulder. The air in the corridor outside was distinctly different. It lacked the heavy claustrophobic heat of the gymnasium. It smelled of institutional floor cleaner and boiled cabbage from the mess hall. He stepped out into the hallway and leaned against the cold concrete wall. He finally dropped his canvas shoes to the floor and slid his feet into them. The thin soles offered little protection against the chill of the floor, but they made him feel dressed again, civilized. "Hey," a voice croaked from the doorway. Charlie turned his head. Officer Miller was standing half in, half out of the gymnasium, holding the heavy door open. His face was pale, his jaw tight. The arrogance that had coated his features 20 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cautious, wide-eyed reverence. You want me to call an escort to your car?" Miller asked, his voice lacking any of its former bravado. It was the tone a man uses when addressing a loaded firearm. "No," Charlie said softly. His voice was calm, a melodic contrast to the harsh environment. "I know the way." Miller nodded quickly, swallowing hard. "Okay. Yeah. Okay." He paused, looking back over his shoulder at Hatcher, who was now being awkwardly propped up by 2 other guards, his face a mask of agony. Miller looked back at Charlie. For what it's worth, he had it coming. Nobody's going to hear about this. It didn't happen. Charlie didn't smile. He knew exactly what Miller meant. The guards wouldn't tell the press because it contradicted their worldview. They couldn't explain it, and what men can't explain, they deny. To admit that their biggest, most terrifying monster was dismantled by an actor in slacks would shatter the fragile illusion of control they maintained in the yard. It would become a ghost story, whispered only among themselves on late-night shifts, slowly warping into myth until none of them were sure if it had actually happened at all. "Take him to the infirmary," Charlie said. "His patellar tendon is likely torn. He won't walk on it without surgery." Miller blinked, startled by the clinical precision of the diagnosis. "Right? Yeah, of course." Charlie turned and walked down the long, gray corridor. The walk to the parking lot felt like a transition between 2 different planets. He passed through the heavy steel gates, nodding silently to the perimeter guards who had no idea what had just transpired in the gym. He pushed through the final revolving door and stepped out into the crisp late afternoon air. The sun was beginning to set over the California hills, casting a brilliant golden hour glow over the landscape. It was the kind of light cinematographers killed for. It was warm, forgiving, and deeply cinematic. Charlie walked to his car, a sleek imported sports car that sat incongruously in the drab visitor's lot. He unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door, sealing himself inside the quiet, leather-scented cabin. He didn't start the engine immediately. He sat in the silence, gripping the steering wheel. He took a slow, deep breath. Wince. The pain in his ribs flared sharply, a jagged line of fire traveling up his side. He carefully unbuttoned his shirt and looked down. A massive, angry bruise was already blossoming just below his heart. The skin was mottled with dark purple and angry red, a chaotic, abstract painting of blunt trauma. He gently touched the bruised flesh with his fingertips. It was tender, radiating heat. Hatcher had nearly broken the bone. A fraction of an inch deeper, a millisecond slower on the retreat, and the giant would have shattered his rib cage. Charlie rested his forehead against the cool leather of the steering wheel. He closed his eyes. The world saw him as a superhero. They saw the blinding speed, the philosophical quotes, the effortless grace. They wanted the impenetrable armor of a modern god. But sitting alone in his car, miles away from the cameras and the adoration, Charlie felt the heavy, exhausting weight of his own humanity. He was just a man with bruised ribs, aching knuckles, and a temper he couldn't always control. He was trapped in a paradox. He preached the gospel of peace through self-knowledge, yet his entire empire was built on his ability to inflict precise, devastating violence. He wanted to transcend fighting, but whenever the world pushed him, whenever the cynics and the bullies demanded proof, he inevitably fell back on the very thing he tried to escape. He answered them with his fists. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep, throaty purr that vibrated through the chassis. Charlie backed out of the parking space and steered toward the main gate, leaving the concrete box and its violent ghosts behind. The drive back to Los Angeles would take an hour to compose himself, an hour to bury the street fighter and resurrect the movie star. By the time he walked through his front door, he would be Charlie Lee again, smiling, philosophical, and invincible. But as he merged onto the highway, driving into the blinding glare of the setting sun, his hand instinctively hovered over his ribs. He pressed against the bruise, feeling the sharp, grounding pain. He welcomed it. It was real. It was a receipt for the toll he paid to live as a legend. The pain was the only thing that kept him from floating away entirely, a heavy, throbbing anchor tethering the myth to the earth. If this raw look behind the legend of Charlie Lee resonated with you today, hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates the gritty reality of martial arts. Subscribing to the channel ensures you never miss our deep dives into the untold, unfiltered stories of history's greatest icons. Drop a comment below. Would you have kept your cool in that cinder block gym or thrown the first punch? Stay grounded, stay sharp, and we'll see you next time.